Sex. It has a way of getting people's attention, and certainly the Hollywood saying sex sells has been shown to be rather true. Perhaps more than ever, we live in a time saturated with sexual content, and it's not just on shady corners of the internet or red light districts anymore. With TV moving from cable to streaming services, the standards of what's acceptable to show on screen for mass audience has changed drastically. In a capitalist economy that prioritizes attention to drive ad revenue, one of the simplest explanations for this rise in sexual content is that the producers are simply giving people what they want. In days past, philosophers and theologians would have referred to this type of insatiable appetite as a passion. For St. John Chrysostom, one of the towering figures in the history of the church, especially in the East, but really for the entire church, for him there are two chief passions of the human race. They are anger and desire. Now, perhaps the strongest expression of the latter is sexual desire. Now, John Chrysostom is not the only person to notice the role desire plays in the human life, of course. Nearly all of the great religious traditions speak of the danger of desire. The Tao Te Ching, for instance, says the greatest crime is desire, or too much desire, depending on the translation. And this gets to an interesting point. In Eastern traditions especially, there's a certain keenness on the notion of ridding oneself of desire to achieve equanimity and enlightenment. I'm not sure if you've ever tried to not desire anything, but it turns out it's really hard. Now, while some figures in the Christian tradition have spoken of ridding oneself of the passions entirely in kind of like this Eastern sense, the tradition on the whole has struck a slightly different note, instead warning against evil passions or disordered passions rather than just passion as such. Now, returning to Chrysostom, he says that anger and desire aren't the problem by themselves, but they must be corrected and brought into order. In his view, that's precisely what's happening in Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll be looking at today. By the way, it's been a while since I've made one of these Bible study videos, and though they perform abysmally, I've found that they're really good for my soul. If you find that they're good for yours and you enjoy them, do let me know. And if you'd like to see more of them, consider becoming a patron. It's my patrons who allow me to spend time making videos that are financially irresponsible to make, like this one. In Matthew 5:27-30, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." Just as in the previous section of the Sermon on the Mount that we looked at last time, Jesus moves from the visible act to the invisible motivations. In that last video, we saw that Jesus didn't just condemn murder, but he condemned being angry at your brother. Now he turns to the other great passion that St. John Chrysostom gives us, desire, and says it's not just adultery that is bad, but it's lust that's sinful as well. Now, this is part of the great moral genius of Jesus. Whereas our kind of modern moral mantra is often, it's okay as long as no one gets hurt, Jesus says simultaneously, it's the heart, not just the consequences that matter, and people are being hurt in ways that you can't see. Now, on this first point that the heart matters, Jesus recognizes that our inner life has real moral weight. This is the great sword he draws against hypocrisy, one of the chief targets of his moral outrage. When we neglect the moral character of our inner lives, we turn ourselves into hypocrites, or as Jesus said, whitewashed tombs, people who appear holy on the outside while harboring sin within. When it comes to lust, the harm we're doing to ourselves is that we are turning ourselves into the kind of people that view others as objects for our own gratification. Instead of living by the self-giving love that we were created to embody as people made in the image of God, we become humans turned in on ourselves, in the words of Luther, people that care more about ourselves than others. This deforms us, making us not reflect the God who is life-giving love, but the devil who seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. Chrysostom describes giving into lustful desire as letting a wild beast into us. After contrasting just plain old desire with lustful desires, he says the man who does the latter gathers lust into himself. He who, when nothing compels him, brings in the wild beast upon his thoughts, when they are calm. In other words, by letting lust in, we are allowing destruction into our very souls. On the second point, Jesus seems to recognize that people are being harmed even when we can't see it. In this particular context, I think it's rather easy to appreciate that. What Jesus describes as looking at a woman with lustful intent has in other places been called the male gaze, the type of look that lingers on a woman, appraising her and desiring her as an object of sexual gratification. Not only does this harm the man, but it can be terribly harmful to women as well, creating a feeling of being unsafe, especially in a world where men's sexual desire, coupled with their physical strength, is not used to build and protect strong families, but instead to get what they want from women by whatever means necessary. In light of the severity of sexual desire gone awry, Jesus gives an unqualified condemnation. It would be better to tear your own eyes out than fall prey to this sin, which will destroy every part of you. So what does this teaching mean for us? I want to give 3 quick points of application. The first, be careful what you consume, or it may consume you. Look, I'm not here to give you black and white boundaries on what you can and cannot look at. I'm not going to give you a kind of a forbidden list of shows or movies or websites. But I'd ask you to be honest. Is the media you consume leading you toward lust? Is it really the plot you're into, and the appeals to your sexual desire is not even a factor in what's keeping your attention? I had to wrestle with this recently. My wife and I both love fantasy books, and recently we started a fantasy show. It was a great, well-produced show, but there was one problem. At least for me, it was way too sexual in nature. Now, could someone else watch it without a problem? Probably. But I had to ask myself, if my goal in life is to become a saint, is this helping me in that endeavor? And here's the thing about lust. You may be strong one moment, like when you have that show on. Maybe in that moment you can resist the temptation to lustful desire. But lust has a way of sticking with you. Chrysostom describes lust like a flame that can ignite even after the person, or in our case an image, is no longer in front of us. He writes, "For he who hath once kindled the flame, even when the woman he hath beheld is absent, is forming by himself continually images of shameful things, and from them often goes on even to the deed." When it came to that show, the answer for me was clear. It simply wasn't worth the risk. It wasn't worth having those images in my mind that could lead to trouble in the future. Which leads to my second point. Better the eye than the body. Paul was exceedingly wise when he told Timothy to flee from sexual temptations. Even if you could win the battle against temptation to lust when watching something that feels borderline to you, why get in that fight at all? Don't put yourself in losing situations. As Jesus said, better to lose an eye than your whole body. My challenge to you would be to recognize the sin at its roots. As James said, desire gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, leads to death. None of us need more death in our life. The easiest way to win against sin generally, and lust specifically, is to flee the fight before it ever gets started. There would be no virtue in a toddler trying to fight a professional MMA fighter if he didn't have to. I hate to break it to you, but in this analogy, in the battle against lust, you're the toddler, not the MMA fighter. You will lose. 3, take radical responsibility. I want to give this challenge to men specifically. I think we can fall into 2 errors from the fact that this passage is addressed to men. The first is that we assume lust isn't a problem for women. It is. The second error is to believe that lust looks the same and has the same consequences for men and women. It doesn't. Can women objectify men and harm them? Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's a reason Jesus addresses men here. When men don't get their sexual desires under control, they wreak havoc on society, and they use their strength in the most heinous of ways. There's something else important here, though. In this passage being addressed to men, it puts the responsibility squarely on us. I'll be honest with you guys. I hate it when guys blame women for their problems with lust. Do better. It's time to apply the language of radical ownership and responsibility that men seem so fond of these days to this domain. Men's lust isn't the fault of the liberal agenda, Hollywood, or women. It's ours, and we need to take ownership. Before I close, I want to say, I get it, guys. It's much easier to preach about this stuff than practice it. Believe me when I say I know firsthand how hard this battle can be, and I'm not here to shame anyone for where they are in the fight. I can tell you this. On a practical level, there are a few lies that will hold you back in this battle. The first is believing that you can put yourself in situations geared toward causing you to sin without sinning. Don't play with that fire. The second, and this was huge for me personally, is that there are real consequences to lust. It is not the sin that doesn't hurt anyone. It does. It's hurting you. It's hurting the people caught up in the industries built on exploitation of the vulnerable. And it's hurting a society that's plagued by families broken by men and women that didn't know how to handle sexual desire responsibly. Third is the lie that you can fight this alone. Sexual sin has a way of driving us to shame, and shame leads us to isolate, assuming that if we told anyone, they would reject us. Your sins aren't that unique. Trust me. Don't travel these paths alone. And the final, most destructive lie is that your sin is greater than God's grace. At the end of the day, I'm not interested in mere self-help. I'm interested in the grace of God that saves us, and the Heavenly Father that sees us prodigals from afar off and comes running for us, the God who delights in his children even when they're covered in the mud of sin and shame. Look, that is the God that we serve, a God who loves you. I don't know where you're at, but God does, and he loves you in the midst of it, and he wants only your best. All the desires that swirl within us are ultimately desires for God. It is, as Augustine said, that our hearts are restless until they find rest in God because they were created for